there's a reason that a coffee sings out to you on the table. There's something that you found that you've either never tasted before, it tastes amazing, or this particular expression of it is unique. And so finding ways to use your roast profile to maximize that unique experience and kind of, in a way, chase that flavor experience down and be able to provide that to your customers. That's the biggest thing that informs my roasting. Like, there are a few little guidelines that I tend to go by.
Welcome back to Coffee with April. My name is Patrick Rolfe, and this is a conversation with some amazing professionals and entrepreneurs in the coffee industry, sharing their perspective and experience. It's about integrity, quality, and the future. For this episode, we had the opportunity of sitting down with Mr. Rob Huss, arguably one of the most well-known coffee roasters in the world, as well as consultants. This was right after the Loring workshop here in Copenhagen, and we're really happy to be able to share an insight into his world and how he looks at coffee roasting. So welcome, guys. We're doing this. Yeah, exactly. This is the first time we're doing this with camera as well. So for those of you that will listen to this, you can also actually watch this now on YouTube. Let's see how that turns out. I'm standing in Copenhagen, in our roastery, or the factory here at Copenhagen, the Loring showroom, together with Rob.
Yeah. Hi.
Finally, it's been. For anyone roasting, everyone comes across your work, I think, at one point in the career. Definitely the book you did, which we're going to talk about later as well. But we haven't had the opportunity to finally have a conversation about
ships
coffee.
in the night a little bit.
Yeah. What brings you to Copenhagen?
Yeah, so we're here and we're doing Loring roaster training, which has been a lot of fun. Did it over the last 3 days, specifically focusing on getting some people ready to be demonstrators and trainers for Loring in Europe. And it's been an absolute pleasure to be able to come over and do that.
Yeah, super cool. And we saw each other briefly in Paris as well.
Yep.
Before this, it wasn't their national roasting competition, it was something else, but it was a roasting competition, I think.
Yeah. And then also just very briefly passed you in the hall in Boston.
Yes, for sure. And I think even outside the conference in Seattle as well, like super quick. I think I went up to you and was like, Rob. So it's super cool to finally have some time together, right? And this whole Loring workshop has also been really, really interesting. As most of you know, I've been roasting on Loring for quite some time, but what we've done now is more of a deep dive into the actual technology, I would say, and the research that's gone into roasting from the Loring aspect of things as well. And roasting is one of those things that can be really artisanal and a bit arty, and it can also be really technical depending on what you're into and not.
Absolutely.
But yeah, as I mentioned before as well, when I think of Loring, I think of you, right? You're a part of it, right? There's a few people that we mentioned together with the brand of Loring, and you've been in the forefront of that for a very long time.
Yep.
And I'm personally very interested in learning where did that come from?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of it came down to when I actually made the move to Portland, Oregon from Cincinnati, Ohio, where I first learned to roast. And when I was getting ready to move out there, it's actually kind of an amazing story. I contacted my boss because one of the baristas that I had trained, because I did barista training as well,
was that before roasting?
So I did it at the same time as roasting also, but yeah, I was a barista trainer before being a roaster.
Okay, cool.
And then was doing it while I was roasting for the shop in Cincy. And one of the people that left our shop in Cincy to move to Portland to kind of make it as a barista in the big city, when she was looking for job postings, saw the job posting for Nossa Familia, where I'm currently at. And Cassandra said, Rob, these people look like a ethical fit for like the way that you think of coffee. And I would apply, but I have no experience, so I think you should apply and try and come out. And so I chatted with Augusto, who's the owner of Nossa Familia, or the president, you should say, I guess, twice over the Skype, and put in my 2 weeks notice. And 2 weeks to the day that I put in my notice, I landed in Portland.
Oh, wow.
And some friends helped bring stuff over and then crashed with me for a little bit and enjoyed Portland. But yeah, was my first encounter with Loring because my boss was an engineer.
Yeah.
and he absolutely adored the engineering on a Loring. And at the time, they were still relatively unheard of. And
because you told us during the workshop now you had machine number 6.
Yeah.
Was that correct? Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
so
It's like one of the really, really first ones, right?
yeah, and we acquired it used actually from Flying Goat Coffee in California.
Sure.
So when that roaster arrived and was basically in the facility the day I arrived, and so my whole first day at Nossa was actually assembling the 35.
That's a good start now, yeah.
Yeah, since it was used with no instructions. And so, yeah, it was.
And that went perfectly fine, or was that
It took a little bit of figuring out,
Sure.
and at the time I hadn't heard of Loring or anything, and so it definitely took a little bit of adjustment in terms of figuring it out. But it wasn't too long after, because that was end of January, so January 31st, 2012, my official date being February 1st. In April that year, during SCA Expo, felt pretty sorted on the machine, and that's actually when I met Mark Loring
Sure.
for the first time, as well as Scott Robinson, who works for Loring.
Yeah.
And we just hit it off really well with them, because they had inquired if they could do a demo there in 2012 on the Loring machine, since SCAA back then was in Portland.
Yeah, sure.
And so they came out and spent a whole day with us, and were absolutely fabulous. Even though we had a used machine, they wanted to make sure it was in tip-top shape. So they literally pulled the whole machine apart and checked every piece. I think they put a brand new burner on it for us, checked everything, refurbed it, and then during the demo, they decided that they liked liked the way that I was roasting on the roaster and talking about it and how I'd figured it out so quickly, so well, that they actually started bringing me down as a consultant to work with them in Santa Rosa on product development, testing, stuff like that.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So you were basically one of the first consultants they ever worked with then, right?
I have no idea, but it was earlier on, so maybe. But yeah.
Cool. And that was a natural, because I think a lot of people are. I mean, it's always interesting when you look at roasters. There's very few of them that I think have done the kind of journey that you have done with books, brand ambassador for Loring, more or less. I think that's what you can call it. Plus, basically head roaster. How do you fit everything in? How do you make all of that make sense, right? Because it's and also from a career path, because I think as a coffee roaster, or a coffee professional in general, it's just hard to decide where you want to go and how to get there. And it seems like you just managed to do everything.
Yeah, I mean the whole book and the process around that and the direction I've gone is really just kind of come in some ways. There's definitely a bit of luck behind all of it. When I was working in Cincinnati, Ohio, as a company, we didn't really have the money or the staff time to be able to send someone to go to an event of really any kind. We could do sometimes local barista throwdowns, but that was about the extent of it. So I definitely felt when I was in Cincinnati a little bit isolated in terms of the overall roasting community.
Yeah, sure.
There wasn't as much online back then either, and a lot of the people, and this happens some places more so than others, but a lot of the people back then were very guarded. They felt like they were protecting some sort of big secret when it came to how to roast coffee.
Yeah.
And so the decision I ended up making was that I was going to just buy a 1 kilo roaster and just experiment as objectively as I possibly could until I figured out why certain flavors seemed to show up and why they didn't in certain coffees and with certain roast profiles and all of that sort of stuff. So that ended up being the process I started on there. Never necessarily intending to publish a book until later on down the road. So then when I moved to Portland, I had already had relationships with some farmers in Guatemala that I've worked with now since, I think we figured out 2010. That's when I first went down and visited Julio down in Santa Maria de Jesus, and kind of partnered up with them for the long haul, helped invest a little bit in their production so they didn't have to pre-finance their harvest themselves by doing microloans, stuff like that. And so when I moved over to work with Augusto at Nossa Familia Coffee in Portland, brought that relationship with me. And Augusto was kind enough to change some of the mentality behind the company, which formerly was Nossa Familia being our family, because his family grow coffee in Brazil. And so we buy a lot, so like Fazenda Cachoeira de Grama, Fazenda Recreo, Vereda, São Francisco, all of these are relatives of Augusto's. And so, but he decided then that it should shift from meaning literally we're buying my family's coffee to it should mean our family in the sense that we treat everyone that we work with as if they are family. And hopefully you listening in have a positive idea of what family is. If not, I'm sorry for that. But
sure.
the idea is the positive version of family, I guess.
Exactly. Definitely.
So then I worked as the lead roaster there, as well as the green coffee buyer and the barista trainer, and sometimes would pull production shifts or barista shifts depending on what the need was.
Sure.
So doing a little bit of everything, all while also fitting in time to do research for what ended up becoming the book. And once I felt like I had arrived at a place where I had something worth saying, or that I thought might be worth saying, that's when I decided to actually put down the words, and failed miserably at that for quite some time. And,
Sure.
and my wife, Laura, actually had the best advice ever to me. She said, you keep writing it and deleting it all, and then writing it and deleting it all. You just need to get everything out on paper. And so go out in the garage, which is where my computer was at the time. So go out in the garage with whiskey and just put everything down all at once. Don't edit yourself, don't do anything. And I followed that advice, and within a couple of days had they'd been bouncing around in my head for quite some time, and I already had all the research and citations that were in there kind of collated and ready to go. And so it took only a few days to hammer it out, and then the editing process, which took a substantial amount of time longer.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's fair to say with books, I mean, it's something everyone wants to say they've written a book, but they don't want to actually write a book, because when you get your hands dirty and you sit there, you realize that it's actually tons and tons of work. It's not an easy process.
Yeah.
And more than often, as you say as well, you end up in a situation where you have a clear view maybe of how you want other people to portray you, and you think when you read what you wrote that doesn't come out, but then what you really need is someone else to just objectively look at it and determine if it's good or bad, instead of you yourself criticizing it, because then you're never going to be done, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it's definitely been a nerve-wracking process, because then also everything's in stone in a sense. Like at this point in time, here's what Rob thought about roasting, and if it came out to be complete and utter bullshit, I don't know if I can say that on your podcast.
You can say whatever you want here.
If it came out to be absolute bullshit, then it's my reputation.
I think it's a great book personally. I mean, I think that was the main thing with Scott's original book as well. When he wrote the first profile book, or whatever you want to call it. It was also like, I mean, it's always scary when you put something out there, especially in a industry that is so young, and a trade that is so young, and we're still learning, we're progressing. I say myself to people that if they for some reason have consultations with me or try to learn from what we do, then if you come back to me 6 months from now, I'm going to tell you something different, right? Because it's a process, and you learn, and I think that's part of the beauty with doing it. And I mean, it also it requires a fair amount of guts to write it down. Right? Because as you say, people love to criticize stuff.
And I took a sidestep. So I called it a manifesto, thinking that by calling it a manifesto, it would portray the fact that I'm just saying these are my
it's
opinions.
Coming from you. Sure.
And not necessarily claiming complete fact, because I don't have the scientific instruments to test a lot of it.
Sure.
We've done some testing, and some things have come out as we expected, and some things maybe not.
Yeah.
Which is currently working on a second iteration, but it's
okay.
It takes a lot longer with 3 children, as
like one children per book. Yeah. Sure.
So that kind of came out, and that really caused a huge uptick in the consultancy side of things, in terms of just ended up doing it a lot more. And so at a certain point, we decided with Nossa that, hey, I'm having to leave too much, and so we ended up bringing on Kyle Brewer, who's our head roaster now.
Cool. Yeah.
And he does all the actual day-to-day roasting for Nossa, helps me with some profile development, so some are profiles of his own creation, and then I handle mostly the green buying, the majority of the profile development, and then general QA/QC, both in our roastery and as well as our cafes.
Yeah. So, really cool. Let's go back to, because it's something we touched on also. So again, we've been 3 days here at the factory talking about roasting coffees as well. Yeah. They did a really not a mean test, a really good test, which I kind of failed on, but we did this fun thing where you provided a profile, which we didn't know before, and a 3 kilo batch size on this, because Loring recommends you push between 20% up to basically 100% on the machines, right? So we got a 3 kilo baseline profile that we haven't seen before, burner changes or anything, and the job was kind of to follow that profile, which was interesting. But my point here is that we've been pretty technical, and we've been really kind of digging deep into some things. And then I think the last thing you said was still like, if we all love our coffees and our customers love our coffee, then, it's a good time.
Yeah.
And I think that's really nice because coffee, whether we want to or not at this point, it's hobby science at best, right? Which is, on one side, from my perspective, that's really frustrating as well, because I want to understand what it is we're trying to do. I think coffee is one of those, at least coffee roasting is one of those few things where, and that might actually be part of the challenge, where we can make tasty coffee without needing to understand how we made tasty coffee.
Yes, that is very true.
And I think there's very few trades where you can do that, because most trades, especially mechanical, you need to kind of understand how to do something to be able to achieve a good result. But here in coffee, we started to do coffee that people like in different ways, objectively, right? But each roastery, and now we're trying to figure out what we actually did to make it taste that way, right? And I think that's a really interesting, very complicated process.
Yeah.
But if we go back to the book as well, and you guys should all read it, of course.
He's being too kind. It's better than Ambien. So if you're wanting to, kick off and go to sleep, it's the perfect recipe.
No, but they should. And I think, back to what you said as well, we talked a lot about that here as well, different roast styles, different roast approaches. I always emphasize that you can learn from everyone.
Yeah.
Always, right? Always. Regardless of if they, like their coffee, not like their coffee, whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
And this few days have proven that as well, right? It's a lot you can learn, it's a lot you can understand from all kinds of roasters, right? So of course they should. But what are the kind of main things that you want to point out are the most kind of interesting points of the book that you relate to the most or feel are the most interesting at the moment?
For me, it was more just trying to have a tool or a cheat sheet to basically be able to be like, I've roasted this coffee this way, and here's what I'm tasting, and I want to be able to get more X out of it. What part of the profile should I look at, and how should I shift it to kind of make that come out a little bit more, or make it appear at all if it's there in the coffee. And so that's kind of the big goal with it all, honestly. And some of it's, I didn't put any timings in there because the timings are very different for everybody depending on your water, your style of brewing, your style of roasting, all that sort of stuff. But the like one example would be if you're roasting a coffee and the acidity to you is a little bit too sharp. Then by giving it a longer development time to the same end temperature and color, you can help reduce that acidity a little bit and kind of soften it somewhat.
Yeah.
Not that one is good and one is bad, but it kind of helps you hopefully take a step with your coffee in the direction that you want to go. So that's the main goal. And a lot of people, I think, felt frustrated initially that it refers to baseline for all these things, and then how many seconds are varied off baseline. And there's no written down baseline at all. And
okay, sure.
I'm always happy to provide it when people message me and stuff like that. But the one thing I wanted to be very cognizant of is a lot of times we see people in the industry kind of look at something or look at somebody that they decide for one reason or another, they're like, oh, I respect this person, and so I'm going to roast like they do, which is a totally fine way of doing it too. But one of the things, and you mentioned this earlier, that I love about our industry is how different everybody goes at things. And we could give the 10 roasters the exact same coffee, and most of them would come up with different expressions of that coffee, and we'd be able to taste different nuance and flavor. And I think that that's really unique and pretty amazing that we can own a style, or that we can speak with our own voice when it comes to the artistic side of roasting, which is really which coffees you buy, how you choose to roast them, how you're presenting them to your customers, and that sort of thing. Yeah,
sure. And as we touched upon many times as well during these days, you don't want all coffee to taste the same. Right? That would be incredibly boring.
Be very dull.
And then we wouldn't need to be here anymore, right? Because why start a new coffee roastery if your goal is to make coffee that tastes in the way like coffee is already tasting, right? If you don't bring anything new to the table, then why be there? I think one of the things that I've also seen, I think you were a part of that Cropster iteration. Right? They did a new update with the yellowing phase, the different phases, I think, which is something that I often connect with you as a roaster, because that's kind of been a trademark of you now. Yeah. Do you want to go through that process a bit and what that was?
Yeah, I mean, the Cropster folks were really nice in that they've provided that as a tool, and that they kind of halfway say it to me. I mean, I'm not the first person that's noted color change or anything like that, or first crack by any stretch, since first crack's been documented for so long. But the fact that they saw how I was roasting, and at one point, I think in maybe it was 2013 or 2014, I sat down with the Cropster folks and talked them through at length kind of the approach that I'm taking in the book, and what that meant. And they did iterate it, which was really lovely of them, and I'm definitely appreciative of that, because they sure didn't have to, but yeah.
So I think that's a really cool feature, and especially after these days now, that's something that I've been. I mean, it's been in the back of my mind for a long time, but I think that now the timing of temperatures, I think, becomes a bit more relevant, and I think we're still very much at a point where a lot of people, when roasting, are focusing a lot on crack and what happened there, and then not so much focus on what's happening before that, right? Whether that is turning point or yellowing, and the kind of phases we had there, right? So I think that's definitely something that I personally would take into consideration as well. If we go back to the kind of very, very, very beginning, how did you end up in coffee, and why did you end up in coffee?
Yeah, so it's definitely a funny /embarrassing story, the first little bit.
Go for it.
But
I love those.
I definitely enjoyed it as well. So I used to go to church with my mom pretty regularly, and when I was there one time, they said, "Hey, can you brew some coffee?" I was like, "Well, yeah, that sounds like a fine thing. I can figure this out." Hadn't brewed coffee before, because my mom would always brew it, or my dad or something. And so I go to put coffee in the filter, and I figure, well, if the filter's this tall, then that must be how much coffee you put in there. And so I took the filter all the way up to the very tip top and brewed it, and it was a mess. It was an absolute mess. So the next time I came back, they actually had a picture of me that I don't know where they must have gotten it from a friend of mine or from my mom, and it had an X through it. So it was my face with a red X through it over the coffee maker, basically saying, "Hey, you need to back off this, buddy." And so my friend at the time, he's still my friend, actually. We talk pretty regularly, but his name's Zach. And Zach looked at me, he goes, "People are becoming foodies these days. We both like coffee. What if coffee became our thing?" And it was just like that casual, like, "Hey, what if this is something we got into?" And so we would hang out nightly and watch really terrible sci-fi movies together. I have a soft spot in my heart for really poorly directed, awful storyline, terrible, graphics movies. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to get myself or you in any trouble by naming terrible movies off. But
we can do it in the comments.
In the comment section, so we'd watch like all these terrible movies, and every week he and I would both buy a pound of coffee, and we would, over the course of the week, French press it side by side every single day, basically.
Oh, that's pretty hardcore for being like just into coffee.
Yeah, just jump on in both feet, sure. I guess. And eventually we started being able to taste the difference between like at first it was like, oh, it's coffee, and this one maybe is like lighter or darker. And then we started being able to taste the difference. And then I remember it was the one that always stuck out to both of us, and we've talked about it since, was we bought a Colombian Cup of Excellence coffee one year, and we tasted it, and we got what we considered at the time to be jalapeno for the first time. It was the first time we really had a very distinct note that both of us were like freaking out about. And so that kind of cemented it. Then when I went into college, I started working as a barista.
Okay. What did you study at college?
Oh,
I'm allowed to ask that?
Yes, you're absolutely allowed to ask it, and so I will answer it as diplomatically as I can. I'm just kidding. So what I studied and where I'm at in my life now are very, very different, and so I say that because I don't want anyone to think that I still hold to certain ideas that are associated with it. But my realm of study was preaching ministry. So I was studying to become a minister, so I'm classically trained essentially in public speech for my undergraduate.
Oh, wow.
And my master's was in New Testament studies. So I was going to go on to be a professor at a seminary was my goal.
Sure.
various life things happened that kind of have led me to the point where I'm away from the church entirely. So it's a bit weird to tell someone that you're a minister, and then there's a lot of baggage that can come along with that.
Sure.
Or you're trained as a minister. I'm not a minister now, although I might still be ordained in the state of Ohio technically, but I don't know if they follow up on that and cut people off their list or anything. So if you need a marriage in the state of Ohio,
call this guy.
if it's still legal. But anyway, so ended up moving away from that, and because I'd worked in coffee during college, and because I absolutely loved coffee, I went back to being a barista when I decided to separate myself from it, from the religious part of that. So.
And what is this stuff? Because I think that's, I mean, I still, it's not so many these days, but I mean, I have been in coffee in a few years now, and I think I still have friends that feel that they are, well, they're in the industry, but they're stuck as baristas. So I'm really curious often how people manage to do that leap to something else in this industry, because I believe there's a lot of people that are in the kind of, I mean, we're all baristas from the beginning. That's how 99% of us starts, right? But again, there's very few that actually manage to kind of take that next step. Or they go on to do other stuff with their life, right? How did you kind of manage to go from barista to roaster?
So I was, at the cafe I was working at, once I got out of what I was doing, they had a roaster, and I just kind of kept showing myself very interested in coffee, and you know, maybe more so than some of the people that were working with me. And so when they had the opportunity for somebody to start working in coffee, I was one of the few people that had shown a lot of genuine interest and had been there for a little bit. And so I was given the opportunity. I like to joke that my old boss also saw the opportunity because I could lift a bag of coffee by myself, that he only had to staff one person. So
it's a good testament.
No, it's I definitely don't think it was that, but I showed interest and worked really, really hard. And it is tough. And what I tell people whenever they ask me, because sometimes baristas will ask me this question, and part of it's a gamble. So part of it is like at our roastery in Portland, there's not a lot of turnover on the roasting side. Like we have the same roasters for a long period of time, and so part of it is you have to put in time at a particular place and continuously show yourself as being interested, because you're going to end up trusting somebody with the important task of roasting who you know. And so you could have all of the capability in the world, and you can have all of the drive in the world, but if you're not a known person and you're trusted within the company to be timely, to be, you know, responsible, to do all these things, then you're probably not going to get a chance. Yeah,
I mean, it's quite a lot of money connected to it, right? I mean, a failed, you guys have a 70 kilo lowering now, a failed batch there. It's quite a lot of money, for example.
Quite a lot. At minimum, that'd be what, you know, $210 US for a fail. So it's and it's hard because, you know, I understand people's desire to move around and try and find the next best thing, and it's hard to want to stick at a place and stay in something that maybe doesn't fit your life at that time. And as the big cities are getting more expensive, it's harder to be just a barista anywhere that's a big city. So, you know, I think some people maybe even have an easier time getting into roasting by working for smaller companies in parts that are not so crowded, because then they at least get the foot in the door as a roaster and get experience, and then they're able to use that experience later. But coming in as a barista in a larger city, I think would be very challenging to make the move up. But
yeah, sure. I mean, you need a lot of. I personally had a lot of. I had a lot of invested hours. So I mean, it was part of, as you say as well, building up trust in your first company, and have them realize that you are someone they can depend on to do stuff, gets it done. But then also just a bit of luck. Right?
Yes, absolute luck as well.
I had when I first started, it was basically me packing coffee in the roastery, kind of alternating with barista shifts, and then the one roaster decided to quit, more or less. And, you know, truth be told, if that person hadn't quit, I wouldn't be roasting anytime soon, right? And would most likely not stand here today with you as well, right? So it's an interesting, it's a really interesting process.
Yeah, and we definitely have advantages too. I mean, there's still a lot of bias in the industry, and so we come, at least I can speak for myself in the U.S. It's a bit of a position of privilege being a white male as well.
Sure.
Which is unfortunate with whether it be explicit or implicit bias on the part of people. So but yeah, so I agree with you. It's a bit of luck, like to be anywhere, I think, for sure.
Yeah, we see that. Especially, back to the point that you just mentioned, there's still very few girls roasting coffee, for example, right? And I'm not sure why. I think that previously, in terms of staff that I've been hiring in other roasteries that I worked for, it almost only was girls, because they're better at so much things than most guys are. They're more reliable, smarter, have a better sensory skill usually as well. So I tend to kind of gravitate to that. But
so support She's the Roaster. Hashtag She's the Roaster.
Yes, you should have had the t-shirt. No, you don't have the t-shirt.
I wore it the first day.
Yeah, the t-shirt. Well, we're gonna post a picture with the t-shirt somewhere so that people can see it, right?
Yeah.
But to be fair, as I mentioned as well, girls have been basically killing it the last years in like coffee competitions and everything. You are getting better than we are, more or less, right? So it's us that kind of needs to step up as well. But no, it's a very, very interesting process. Part of why we started this podcast and why we do any of this kind of media stuff and the craze that goes with it is that I'm thinking a lot back on when I first started in coffee. And which was probably because I was a bit ignorant and pretentious and not smart enough to find information in the right places. But it was pretty hard starting up, where it was very little information. It was very little good information, I think, as well, or like solid, kind of proven information. What would you be, for someone that is starting a coffee roastery, from a roasting perspective, what it does, like picking machine, green coffee, profiles, whatever. What should people think about? How should they start? What's the most important thing? You've been consulting, I don't know how many roasteries, but I'm sure there's quite a few of them.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but yeah, a decent number at least, I think. Yeah. There's a lot to be said for what you mentioned earlier, which is finding your own voice, and kind of like, if you're not bringing anything to the table, how does that help differentiate you from other roasters or that sort of thing. So finding kind of your own voice and sticking to that and really having something to say, because I think customers really identify with your vision, and once they understand and see your vision, if they identify with it, they're going to become a customer.
Yeah, sure.
Both in terms of the marketing, the branding, how you conduct yourself, and then ultimately the coffee quality and all those sorts of things.
Hopefully, yeah.
I think that our customers identify with coffee quality probably later on in the chain, where they identify more with the persona, the perceived value, the branding, the marketing, the social media a little bit sooner. So people have asked me sometimes to come work for them, and I tell them that they should actually hire a marketing consultant instead, because they would get far better results, depending on what they're trying to do. Yeah. I don't know that the marketing consultant would be able to roast very well, but you could be surprised as well. Yeah. So that's definitely one thing. And then some advice my grandma used to give all of us, which is funny because she would always be a little bit harsher toward us, but she says, listen to everybody's advice and then do as you damn well please.
Sure.
And so there's nothing wrong with hearing what people are doing and considering it and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, especially if you're starting a business or if you're higher up and running a business, you have to make decisions that fit with what you're doing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think that gets, increasingly more important. You mentioned that kind of as a jokey thing before as well here, where it's like, we should probably not post these profiles on social media, right? And I think that's kind of interesting. Most of us don't post any curves on social media anymore or whatever. And that's, a big part of that is just comments, whether those are ignorant, smart, aggressive, thankful, whatever they are. It's just this, it's just such a noisy environment when you do that. Yeah. And some people are so loud. I've been pretty loud in the past as well with my comments on stuff. But it's also, at a certain point, you wonder, why can't we all just be happy together and kind of learn from each other and move forward together, rather than kind of, as you mentioned, no, this turning point is too low, or this time after crack is too short, or
something along those lines
here, right? And it's impossible to say that from a picture to begin with, which is very important, right? And it's interesting how that environment is. I was hoping that we would be over that now, because I think I saw that pretty strongly in terms of what you mentioned as well, that when I first started, there was very little conversations about coffee roasting. I think now it's a bit more, It's maybe still a bit kind of put the lid on certain things that are not being discussed properly, I think.
For sure.
Then of course we have, the roaster skills and stuff like that is helpful for just a dialogue about roasting. But it just gets, I think it's complicated if you want to move forward. And I'm curious when it comes to you as well, how you will deal with that. Because now, for example, I mean, you're a young guy, you wrote a book, writing a second one on iteration of it. Famous roasting consultant, famous head roaster.
Too kind on both of those.
Yeah, but I mean, true. I'm over it. When did I first hear about you? That was many years ago. But I think you and Scott Rail are the two first names that pops up, I think, in my kind of list of roasters that are not Scandinavian. Since I started to roast in Scandinavia, then, these are the people I'm going to be exposed to first, like Tim Mennebo, Christian Gorbetsson, and stuff like that. So I think definitely you've already at a very high point in the industry, and I'm wondering two things. I'm wondering where will you go from here? Like where does one go from here in terms of what's the next kind of level? Is there one? And two, who do you learn from?
Oh.
I mean, you're very much the educator at this point,
but
right?
You said it already. I still learn from everybody. We also learn, I think, all the time from what we call happy accidents at work, where someone messes up and the profile's way off, and we get the Cropster email saying, this is way off track. You should check it out. And then we cup it, and we're like, the king is dead. Long live the king. All right. This is the new profile.
It actually works. Yeah.
So I think. We're always learning from our mistakes, and I think that the thing that's kept me engaged in this industry for the time that it has and continues to keep me engaged is that there's no end to the learning. And I think when you feel that you've reached the end, it just means you're not looking anymore, because there's always somebody trying something new, something that you've never heard of before, and so I think we all have the opportunity to learn from each other. And I learn from pretty much every consult that I ever do, that I walk away with something, whether I make a connection that I hadn't made before, or the person I'm working with is doing something that is really novel and interesting at the same time, and it becomes something I'm like, this isn't a bad thing you're doing, like this is awesome, like you should keep doing this. I've never seen anyone do this before. So I think that in terms of learning, I'm trying to be open-minded and learn as much as I can all the time still. For where do I go from here? I'm hoping I move toward better work-life balance. I have an amazing wife and three small kids, and I miss them a great deal when I travel. But at this point, it's just kind of part of it. So finding ways to do that. We're doing more trainings, hopefully in Portland, so that I can be near my family, but also have people to the roastery and host them and show them the lovely city of Portland, where we put bacon on pretty much everything. And if you're vegan, we have vegan bacon.
That's a very good thing, though. And I mean, we're all coming next year.
Yeah, for
you told me,
SCA. That's what I've heard.
Which is amazing, right? So I've always wanted to come. So it's amazing.
It's a great city, but I mean, the thing for me is, I guess, I'm really happy with working at Nossa Familia to the degree that I do, and it allows me to engage with coffee farmers, which is probably one of the more rewarding parts, I think, for me still, is being able to work with producing partners who bring so much to the table, and finding ways to pay them more or help them work on projects that they're interested in working on, or just be there and be a part of their life and have them as part of my life. And so that's a huge part forward for me, as well as continuing that kind of work. So.
Oh, for sure. I mean, green coffee is first of all, I mean, it doesn't matter if we learn how to roast better coffee. If the green coffee is not up to standard, we're not going to be able to do it, right? And I'm curious, and on a bit more maybe geekier level here, but different roast styles for different green coffees is something that is quite often being discussed. Some people are doing it, some people don't. I think most people are at a point where they kind of try to separate different processing methods, at least from like washed coffees to natural coffees. But do you have any tips and tricks when it comes to that? I mean, we have so much new coffee coming in, mainly, let's say, Ethiopian coffees, Kenyan coffees are fresh off the shelf soon, and people will start roasting them, versus, if you take something from Costa Rica, what would you actually advise there in terms of roasting, and how different do you need to be to be able to roast a tasty coffee?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it comes down to where it fits in your portfolio. And so I try pretty much, we never buy coffees without knowing where we're going to slot them in, whether it's going to go to a blend or a dark roast or a light roast or a single origin, or kind of how it fits in. So that's kind of the first thing that informs my decision to roast is and even decision to buy is, where is this going in our portfolio of coffee? And then finding coffees that fit that well. So like even sample roasting darkly and cupping coffees darkly to make sure that they actually hold up at a darker roast
if that's
level.
Intended to be dark in the end. Yeah, sure. Yeah, okay.
And so then kind of within that, looking at what we find interesting or novel, especially like when we're talking single origins and light roasts, and what I've jokingly said a couple of times now, employee retention coffee, where your customers may not be too savvy on it, but you keep all of your employees happy and engaged. But figuring out what's interesting or novel about that coffee, and then finding ways to highlight that, because most of us, when we're cupping for single origin purchase, there's a reason that a coffee sings out to you on the table. There's something that you found that you've either never tasted before, it tastes amazing, or this particular expression of it is unique. And so finding ways to use your roast profile to maximize that unique experience and kind of, in a way, chase that flavor experience down and be able to provide that to your customers. So that's the biggest thing that informs my roasting. Like, there are a few little guidelines that I tend to go by, like by having a later first crack, you tend to, and this is just my opinion at this point, so there's no scientific data that I have per se to back this up, but for me, longer to first crack tends to give us a little bit heavier body or mouthfeel, longer aftertaste, a little bit more bitterness, that sort of thing. And so, if I'm wanting a coffee to be big, or do like the traditional espresso style of roasting, I might push first crack back a little bit. Whereas if I want to have these floral notes really shining through or enhance the clarity of the coffee, I might go quite a bit faster to first crack to really kind of be able to taste some of that.
Do you keep the ratio of the yellowing phase the same with a sooner or earlier crack? Or does that change as well?
It can change as well, yeah. So it just depends on what I'm really trying to accentuate. And that'll be even changing sometimes the phase between the beginning of the roast and the beginning of yellowing. So what I've called, I think, drying in there. Changing that around sometimes as well. Just depends on how you plan to thermally load your roaster in order to achieve your profile. So sometimes if you're on a roaster that you can't push real hard in the middle, you have to choose your approach into yellow very carefully to make sure that you have enough momentum to carry through. So sometimes it's the machine that puts constraints on what you're doing, and sometimes not. But yeah, basically just roasting for flavor with that regard, or like, as we talked about earlier, if I want more or less acidity, playing around with my development time to accentuate how that acidity plays out, playing with my end color to change the level of roast character and sweetness. Or perceived sweetness is the sucrose is probably still pretty marginal at that point.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Very true. Where are you on the subject? And again, we don't want to be, which is something we talked a lot about here over these days as well, where we, I don't want us to compare the lowering machine with other machines now, but I want you as just from a personal experience, because you have been roasting on a lot of different machines. And we talked a lot about how do we define the lowering roast machine. And you mentioned pretty strongly that it's a drum roaster that's important to have with you. And we talked about the different kind of aspects of why that is and so on. But what would you say, just from experience, and again, you can roast tasty coffee on all roast machines.
Absolutely.
Just learn how to understand how to use them and you'll be fine, right? I think the most important thing is that some of them you have to use a bit differently to achieve the same result. But what would you say is the main difference between, I mean, let's say a Probat that is often used, at least here in Europe, or Diedrich Shore lowering, or Gießen, or whatever brand you want to refer to, right? But what should people think about with the different machines?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is thermocouple thickness. So you'll notice, like, when people first get on a lowering, they usually are a bit shocked that turnaround is at 45 seconds, and that their temperatures are all completely different, and then also that it tends to need to end at a higher temperature than what they may be accustomed to roasting.
It cracks different, it yellows different.
Everything's kind of all sideways, and that's primarily actually the thermocouple thickness. So It's for those in Europe, it's 1.56 millimeters or 1/16 of an inch for those listening in the U.S., which I think is the only country still doing standard.
Oh, yeah, no, it's just a measurement conversion.
Yeah, decimal point.
We've been talking a lot about Celsius and Fahrenheit here the last
Yeah,
week.
we need to get up on our game and actually learn centigrade.
We should just all do Fahrenheit, don't we? I mean, isn't that is more accurate? We have more points.
Yeah, but we have a decimal point now, though. So
yeah, that's true.
Since there's a decimal point on the screen, it's kind of...
We should all just have one language.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe the most important thing.
Oh, yeah, that'd solve a bunch of things. Until picking the language, you'd have to just start a new one from scratch.
Yeah. Which could be complicated.
But yeah, so I think the thermocouple difference is the big one. So if you actually pulled the thermocouple out of the Loring and put an 1/8 inch thermocouple in there, I think people would instantaneously feel more comfortable with it. Their decision to go with a thinner thermocouple is about responsiveness and accuracy in that sense, because speed is accuracy when it comes to roasting, because it's actually a really short process in general. So I think that's the biggest difference on the user side for people. People sometimes also freak out a little bit about the fact that burner and air are tied together, because they've become accustomed to changing their airflow in their burner and have strong opinions about that one way or another. For me, it's not an issue, and I think you can get similar or the same flavors, at least in terms of people's ability to perceive flavor.
Yeah, I think that was it, because that came up here, and I'm going to be honest to say that I'm not experienced enough to have a solid point on this, but something that you said during these days were that you don't believe you can taste the difference in between the machines. Which, the more I think about it, the more I think that makes sense, actually, especially after these days. But that's interesting, because a lot of people I know would swear that they're able to, for example, do that, right?
Yeah, for sure. And you know, I would say that people have different levels of ability to taste, for sure. In the research I've been doing with Ann Cooper, and she's a consultant based out of Melbourne, an absolutely fantastic coffee professional as well. We've found that it's about 29% of the time people can actually taste the difference in a triangulation between 2 cups obviously being from one roaster manufacturer and 1 cup being from the other.
Roasted to the same specs.
Yes.
Also with like color and then...
Whole bean ground color within a tolerance, I think, of 1.5, I think is our goal. And then I'd have to look, but and then everything else kind of being within the proper time segments, plus or minus, I think, 10 seconds. So it's, some people probably do better than others, but just in terms of talking about a global average, it seems like people have a very difficult time. We're getting some statistical analysis done on the data, which is going to be really fun to see what a statistician says about it. In my very crude way of thinking, it's like, well, 3 cups, you've got a 33 1/3% chance of getting it right. Random chance. So my guess right now is that we're batting below random chance, but I'm not a statistician, so we're going to see how they say as well. But I think it's at least compelling, and I think there are ways to maybe do it even more precisely. So it's less about like, are they chemically exactly the same if we send them through a GCMS or something along those lines, but the real question is, can people actually taste the difference? And this is why, like, for me, the reasons that you buy a roasting machine, you should never feel bullied into it because you hear somebody say, oh, we have to do this machine to get this sort of a flavor. You have to do this machine to get this sort of a flavor. You should look at your cash flow. You should look at what size you need. You should look at all of the different factors and make a choice that works well for your business. Knowing that even if it's maybe not your first choice, you might be able, if you're successful, to do your first choice later on down the road. But I think that that's important, just to know that you have the ability to, and I guess at this point I'm not being a very good brand ambassador if that's what I'm doing for Loring, but I mean, if someone needs a 1 kilo roaster, then they need to buy a 1 kilo roaster to start. And if that's what they have cash flow for, then that's great. They should live their dream and give their voice to the coffee world. But you definitely don't want to buy a roaster that's incredibly large, go into debt, and then fail. And have all that debt hanging over you, just for your own personal well-being.
Yeah, no, I think that's, and I mean, I know that firsthand. Well, actually, not. I mean, I have a roastery without actually buying a roast machine, right? Which is for me one of the only sustainable ways to do it, at least initially, right? Because it's about being able to focus on coffee with a positive mind space. and not feeling that, oh no, I need to pay off this machine now because it's crazy expensive, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's very, very important to start right.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you say, I mean, the more I've been roasting, the more you realize that the differences people are tasting are more based on, for example, probe or anything like that. I think that one of the best examples there, and I mean, it's the kind of 20% rule that we saw launched many years ago by Scarreo. Also a book that everyone should read, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that was an interesting process because that was based on a certain machine with a certain style of probe, with a certain approach of roasting, which a lot of people with alluring back then, myself included, were trying to kind of make that same thing happen, and it didn't really work out, right? So it's very important to understand the machine by itself first, and then decide where to kind of move from that, right? For sure, which again is also pretty complicated. I think that now as well, I mean, I learned a few new things now as well that I haven't really thought about, or that was maybe in the back of my head, but I didn't really think as much as I needed to, right?
Well, and we did the darkest roast this machine's ever seen, which was actually,
we should have put that on. It was basically, I mean, this is not black, but I mean, it was black.
It was quite dark.
Intense.
Yeah,
that was pretty intense. That was like an American medium roast. No, that was dark roast in all cases. I mean, we have a slightly different roast degrees here, which is really cool, right? And I mean, we realized that here. I mean, how many? We've been 6 different roasters here now the last 2 days.
Yeah.
Again,
there were
from like Ben to Mandebo to like from Paris, from Germany, Russia. I mean, pretty scattered from all over the world, and we all have different preferences and thoughts as well. So it's been really interesting to see people's take on it, right?
Yeah. And by the way, if you can't joke your other roasting buddies about, just saying like, oh, you keep underdeveloping your coffee or something like that, that's one of my favorite jokes to tell to people.
Sure.
You got, if you're not having fun in the coffee industry, then you're probably doing something wrong.
I think people miss out on that, right? And as well, like, I mean, you make coffee that you want to make, and you make coffee that your clients want to have, and that's the focus, right? Then if some roaster somewhere or some barista somewhere has loud opinions about that, that's up to them. But I mean, let them do that, right? You don't necessarily have to change everything because someone doesn't like your coffee, right?
Absolutely.
And I still think, especially here in Scandinavia, there's a lot of we roast for other roasters is a pretty common expression, where we want certain people to make a post about how Instagram post or Twitter or whatever about how tasty this coffee is. And that's more important than making coffee that our clients sometimes like, which is probably a pretty unhealthy place to be as an industry, I would argue as well. What are the do you have anything like right now at this point in your career that you want to research more about roasting? Do you have anything?
Loads,
I guess. But I mean, do you have any main thing that is like, this is bugging me right now and I want to just focus on this? Yeah,
I would love to find some sort of way to measure bean temperature that is not just a standard thermocouple. I think that there's...
What are the, because that was kind of interesting as well. Could you explain what you believe is the main issues with that?
Yeah, so there's, on every roasting machine, the bean probe thermocouple, or what we call the bean probe thermocouple, is registering many things other than just beans. We like to jokingly say, or I like to jokingly say, and it becomes a call and response in some classes that I do, but it's the bean can only tell, or the thermocouple can only tell you the temperature of itself. And it can't tell you the temperature of anything else except for itself. And granted, the thermocouple is influenced by what it's in, the substance which it's in, whether it be air or the mass of beans. But the bean probe thermocouple in particular is not just detecting the heat from the beans, but also from any air filtration that's happening through the bean mass. There's probably going to be some radiant heat energy as well. And so it's not completely telling you the temperature of the beans exactly. And so I think that there are benefits to going thinner, and there are some issues that can happen where, because it's so responsive, there's also a chance that it could respond faster than the bean mass is actually able to respond. Which I think we do see on many roasting systems as well, where the thermocouple actually changes and the beans are probably not changing that rapidly because they're a large organic mass of individual beans that are constantly being thrown up into hot airflow, which there is actually causing the majority of the heating and then falling into a mass where they're distributing it slightly among themselves.
Yeah.
And it's just this weird process of get hot fast, drop down, distribute, get hot fast, drop down, distribute. And so there's a lot going on inside of the drum, and we don't really have a clear picture of that yet. So that's one of the things that I think a lot of research needs to go into, whether it's, designing a probe that has a composite material sheath that is able to more mimic the heat transfer properties of coffee, probably at the roasted or roastier level, just because post first crack is really where things kind of start getting wild.
Yeah.
And so maybe we find something that has a similar thermal property to mostly roasted coffee, or I don't know, something along those lines. Or I know that companies like the Alio, I may be saying it totally wrong, the Bullet, are playing around with infrared, which I think is a really interesting bit of technology. You've got other places playing around with real-time color monitoring, like ColorTrack. So I think that there's some interesting options where people are kind of looking around and seeing what else there could be. I think before I make everybody feel really anxious, and I'm looking at the camera for those who are on audio, I'm just trying to connect for a second. Before I make everyone feel very anxious about their thermocouples, I do want to say that I do think they give us enough data to be consistent with what we're doing, batch to batch. And so we are able to be consistent and to make our customers happy with the quality of coffee that they're getting. But I think that both for research and development and for later being more consistent, I think that looking at different technology is really an interesting way forward.
I mean, we talked about that a lot these days, also reference to like color reading and whatnot, that a number is always a good thing, regardless of what that number is.
Yeah.
I remember a few times, a few years back, I think that was also Tim Menebo was kind of involved in that discussion with this old probe ad, having a probe that was super close to the faceplate that was super, super warm. And I think he was, correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, if he even listens. I think he mentioned that it doesn't really matter what the reading is, even if the reading coming slightly from the faceplate, because we're getting a continuous reading, right?
Yeah.
So regardless if that is accurate to what's actually happening, it doesn't really matter as long as we can roast tasty coffee, because then we can just use those numbers again, right?
Yeah.
So the number in itself doesn't have to be perfect, right? To roast tasty coffee, but then, which is my biggest headache at the moment, I want to understand, right? I think we all want to understand,
to grasp what's
more,
really
more
happening,
degree, right? Because it's also an extremely random process, right? Which is very simplistic, but then we have a very complicated part of it where we we talked about, for example, sugars and acids and proteins and how that react differently, and then those are not evenly portioned in the bean. And I mean, it gets really complicated if you want it to be.
Yeah, when you start thinking about the level of complexity just in the bean, it's a bit problematic, because you've got different beans from the same tree that are growing in different parts of the tree and have different chemical distributions already, because they were grown on different parts of the tree starting at different times during different parts of the year. Well, not like different parts of the year, but during different days when they started growing or were fertilized in the first place. Then those are blended from not just one tree, but from thousands and hundreds of thousands of trees together from various parts on the property with various levels of shade, nutrition in the soil, all these sorts of things. We blend them all together. We take them through processing, which can sometimes be a little bit of the Wild West sort of thing, where what happens, and that's it. And it goes through processing, and then it goes through resting period, then it gets shipped internationally. And then when you think about even the individual bean itself, as we talked about, the chemicals are not evenly distributed throughout the bean. And so then when you're roasting the coffee, you have all these beans from various trees, various parts of the tree, gone through processing slightly differently, drying, resting at various parts. And then suddenly we're throwing it all in this roaster, and we're saying, all right, now, fall in line sort of thing. And
yeah, sure. I mean, then we're roasting in the summertime, roasting in the wintertime, where someone is storing the beans in a cold/warm place, and whatever that is, right? I'm seriously wondering if it's even possible to be consistent when you roast.
Yeah. Well, and I think some of the variability that exists is positive. So there was a fun research thing I got to be a part of, where Sataka, which is a color sorting machine, which was able to separate one Nicaraguan coffee by what hue of green it was. Okay. So you had slightly lighter greens all paired together in one category, slightly darker greens here, and then all the way to the darkest green. And I mean, it was definitely a very hedonic test. So like, it wasn't some like, 10 out of 5 customers agree this or whatever, 5 out of 10 maybe. But for us, the big preference was actually toward the original blend. Because while all of the different hues of color were very interesting, they were also very one note.
Yeah.
And it was actually all of them kind of working together that gave that particular blend of coffee. And that was all one Nicaraguan coffee from one lot on one farm. But it was that blend that actually gave it the interest.
Yep. Yeah, so. And I mean, that brings us back to, I always come back to the fact that I think Ethiopian coffee is probably the best coffee in the world quite often. And a big part of that is the unrecognized blend of varietals that are in there, or different strains of the same varietal, and that definitely adds complexity to it, right? So do we want to sort too much? I don't know, I think a part of me wants to, because a part of me really wants to start understanding this better, whereas another part, of course, wants really tasty coffee. But I think one of the things that I've understand here, and I've understand in general after being in the coffee industry for a while now, is that I think the fact that most of us as roasters we're so kind of locked into our expression of taste when we roast, and I'm realizing that we need to start roasting a lot more diverse to be able to understand what we're doing. Whereas if we as a roaster as well at April, I mean, we're roasting coffee that we think is tasty. That's basically the focus we have, right?
Absolutely.
The issue there is that we become very narrow-minded in our styles of roast. So our understanding for a wider range of roasting styles is less, right? And I think a lot of us in the industry are kind of stuck in that, right? Because we're so focused on what we do on a day-to-day basis that we don't have the opportunity to think bigger. Right?
Yeah, or to not have fear of wasting coffee if something doesn't work out.
That's a big part of it as well, right? But then that's why it's cool to have people like you to write the books, to do the research for us, right? Because it's really helpful for all of us in terms of understanding what the fuck it is we're doing. That I'm probably not supposed to say, but we can cut that out later. No. I think
we can bleep it at least. So
we're going to bleep that.
You just bleep it.
We're going to bleep the podcast version, but not the video. I don't know.
Okay.
Let's see. With that...
You have to put the little star over your lips if you...
Yeah, exactly. But we can do that now.
Yeah,
that's part of why we're doing this. With that, I want to say thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
We're going to wrap this up. It's been a very long day, a very long few days. You must be really tired.
Yeah.
We have a dinner to go to as well. We're in Copenhagen. We're going to eat food.
About 3:30 a.m. wake up for me to go to the airport.
That's intense, man. Yeah. But then everyone... read this, buy this if you don't have it. Why not?
Yeah.
And I mean, we'll see this guy in Portland next year.
Yep. Yeah. And if you're ever interested as well, just always hit me up. I'm available. I shook your hand while saying that, which is really awkward, but so it goes. I'll shake your hand again at the end. But yeah, if you're ever interested, I'm at Rob Host on Instagram. I usually try and write people back. If I don't, it's because I usually get distracted pretty easily. So you can ping me back. And I'll get to you, but
It's amazing.
Yeah,
super.
Well, once again, thank you, Patrick, for having me. Yeah,
definitely. From us here at April, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share with your friends, family, and colleagues. Thank you.